Stories Between Us anthology, where Black queer men's lives, love, and tension take center stage. The house sounded different when someone was sick in it. It wasn't louder, it was thinner. Every creak of floorboard carried farther. Every appliance click landed like a decision. Even the air felt like it was holding its breath, afraid that if it moved too hard, it might take something important with it. Theo moved through the kitchen like he'd been trained for it. Not graceful, efficient. A man who had learned to turn worry into motion, who could measure out doses, rinse cups, wipe counters, and keep his face neutral all at the same time. His shoulders stayed squared, his expression stayed calm, his voice stayed useful. It was the middle hour of the night when most people's lives went quiet. In this house, quiet didn't mean rest. Quiet meant listening. He checked the pill organizer again, even though he'd checked it 3 times already. His mother's name, Gloria, was written in Marisa's neat handwriting on the top label, like naming the problem made it manageable. Theo poured water into a glass and watched it rise to the top. His reflection looked back at him in the dark window. His tired eyes, familiar jawline, the kind of face people trusted without asking for proof. He had been the stable one for so long that stability had started to feel like a mask he couldn't remove. From the hallway, he heard the soft, uneven sound of breathing from his mother's room. Just a fragile rhythm that determined when someone needed to check on her. He kept moving. He kept doing. Because if he stopped, he would feel the thing he'd been avoiding all day. That there was no amount of cleaning, dosing, organizing, or planning that could undo what was happening. A knock came at the front door, not loud. More like someone respecting the grief on the other side of the door. Theo paused with the glass in his hand. A knock at this hour meant either bad news or someone who knew that night had become their new normal. He set the glass down and opened the door. Nolan stood there with a duffel bag over one shoulder and an overnight tote in his hand, as if he'd packed for a stay he wasn't sure he was allowed to take. He looked tired too, but it sat differently on him, like he'd been traveling with it for years. His eyes found Theo's face, then flicked past him toward the dark hallway, toward the quiet down the hallway. The energy between them held for a second too long. Theo had seen Nolan before. Birthdays and cookouts. Marisa's endless group dinners that she swore were low-key, yet never were. Nolan had always been present in her life, like a constant. He was laughter in the background, a camera in his hand, a sharp comment on his tongue, a softness he hid behind charm. But here, on the doorstep of a sick house at an hour that didn't belong to visitors, Nolan looked stripped down. Just a man showing up because someone needed him. Theo stepped back, making room without thinking about what it meant to invite him in. Nolan walked inside carefully, like he could feel the fragility under the floorboards. His gaze landed on the medication box on the counter, on the list taped to the refrigerator, on the stack of mail that had gone unopened for days because survival was a full-time job now. Theo watched him take it in, watched the way his shoulders sank with understanding. At this time of night, people didn't do small talk. Nolan set his bags down by the wall, still looking at the hallway, like he could sense the shape of what they were all carrying. At the end of that long second, Nolan finally spoke, quiet and steady, like he'd decided to match the tone of the house. "Marisa called after your mom was taken to the hospital," Nolan said. "I've known her too long not to come." Theo looked at him for a moment, then nodded once. "She's been in and out." Theo said quietly. This last one just scared us all a little more. The spare room used to be storage, old holiday decorations, a treadmill nobody used, boxes of childhood photos Marisa said she'd go through one day. Now it had clean sheets and a blanket folded at the foot of the bed like a promise. Theo had made it up earlier without thinking about why. He had simply done the next necessary thing. That was his specialty. Nolan stood in the doorway, taking in the room like it was too much. Like being offered a place to set down his body felt intimate on its own. The lamp on the nightstand cast a soft circle of light, making everything outside that circle feel like unknown territory. Nolan's presence shifted the room in a way Theo didn't have a name for. The way Nolan filled the doorway without trying. The broad line of his shoulders. The quiet confidence in how he stood there like he belonged in the middle of other people's trouble. It was unfair, Theo thought. That grief had touched everything in this house except Nolan's beauty. The realization landed hard in his chest, then lower, then deeper, enough to startle him, slow enough to feel dangerous. He felt it all at once. The attraction, the guilt, the instinct to step back, the instinct to step closer. Please not this, he thought. Not here. Not now. Not him. Theo turned his face away, jaw tight, hands curling into fists at his sides like he couldn't physically hold the feeling still. But his body had already answered a question his mind refused to ask. Down the hall, a floorboard creaked. Theo's heat for Nolan spiked. He needed to control himself before anyone walked in. But it was only Marisa. She appeared in the hallway wearing a sweatshirt too big for her, her hair pulled back, her face pulled tight from exhaustion and worry. When she saw Nolan, something in her expression loosened. Relief, sharp and immediate, like she'd been holding her breath for days and only now realized it. She crossed the hallway and wrapped her arms around Nolan without hesitation. Nolan held her with the kind of care that wasn't new between them. Like he'd held her through other hard things before, and knew the shape of her when she needed support. Theo watched from the side, quiet, respectful, invisible. That was his role, the brother, the pillar, the one who didn't need anything. Marisa pulled back, wiping at her eyes like she was annoyed at them for existing. "Thank you," she whispered, voice cracking. "I didn't even know what to say on the phone." Nolan smiled, small and sad. "You don't have to. I wanted to come. Gloria means a lot to me, too." Marisa glanced at Theo, then back at Nolan, her eyes bright with the kind of gratitude that hurt to witness. "She's asleep for now," Marisa said. "We're doing shifts. Theo's been doing everything lately." Theo's throat tightened. He turned his face toward the wall, studying the paint like it might tell him how to stand still inside his own skin. Nolan's attention followed Marisa's words straight to Theo. He'd known Theo for years. Calm, quiet, dependable to the point of invisibility. But this version of him was different. He was holding himself together with discipline and love. Masculine in the way he moved. Gentle in the way he listened for his mother's breathing down the hall. It shouldn't have been attractive, but it was. The kind of attraction that surprised Nolan, settled low and slow in his body before he could stop it. Marisa exhaled. "Come sit for a second," she said to Nolan. Theo watched them head toward the living room. From the couch, Nolan reached into his bag and pulled out a familiar liquor bottle, holding it up with one corner of his mouth lifted. Marisa let out a tired laugh before she could stop herself. "I brought your favorite," Nolan said quietly. "Figured if we're gonna be crying and shit, we might as well drink a little." Their voices blurred together after that, catching up between long pauses. Stories that didn't require effort. Laughter that surprised all three of them. For a moment, the house felt normal. Every time Nolan's voice, warm and deep voice, drifted back toward Theo, he felt something else move under his ribs. Nolan's presence wasn't just support. It was temptation. It was danger. It was the kind of lust people build whole lives trying to forget. Theo turned back to the kitchen, rinsing the same glass twice, keeping his hands busy because stillness was dangerous. And still, he couldn't stop thinking about the way Nolan had looked at him earlier. Later, when Marisa finally stood, rubbing her face and heading toward her room, she paused in the hallway. "I'm going to try to sleep," she said softly. "Theo, you can show Nolan the guest room." She smiled tiredly at both of them, then disappeared down the hall. Theo led Nolan toward the spare room. They stopped in the doorway. Close enough to read another man's body like scripture written in heat. The language of muscle and breath. The punctuation of shoulders built for weather. The quiet thunder of a chest that had survived things and still chose to rise. Close enough to feel Nolan before touching ever entered the conversation. To sense the gravity of him, the pull of the comfort of a man at a time like this. Theo wanted him the way exhaustion wants a bed. The way grief wants a witness who doesn't ask for translation. For one trembling moment, he forgot his mother's name. Forgot his sister's eyes. Forgot the thin walls. He wanted to step closer to Nolan's body, to let his sorrow rest its head against something breathing, to trade the sound of medical machines and prayer for the quiet moment of being desired back. The hunger rose in him. Two men in a hallway full of medicine and mercy and unfinished goodbyes, wanting each other the way men do when the world has already taken too much. Just human. Nolan looked at Theo, really looked at him now, at the care worn into his posture, the restraint in his hands, the way he stood like someone who never let himself lean. Theo felt the moment tilt. For one quiet second, neither of them moved. It would have been easy. It would have been wrong. They both seemed to realize it at the same time. Theo stepped back first. Nolan cleared his throat. "Good night. Try to get some sleep," Nolan said softly. "Yeah, I'll try. Thanks for being here," Theo answered. Theo turned away, heart too loud, walking back down the hallway alone. Behind him, Nolan stood in the borrowed room, already knowing something had started that neither of them had expected. Hospitals had their own kind of daylight, fluorescent and unforgiving. It made everyone look more tired than they were and more truthful than they wanted to be. Theo hated it. Marisa hated it too, but she moved through it like she'd learned to. She asked questions. She wrote notes of every word the doctor said. She smiled at nurses with gratitude edged in desperation. Nolan walked behind them, quiet, hands in his pockets, eyes taking in every detail like he might memorize the reality so Marisa didn't have to hold it alone. He carried their coffees without being asked. He opened doors. He kept close without crowding. Theo should have felt only appreciation. Instead, he felt aware. Aware of Nolan's nearness, of the way Nolan's eyes kept drifting to him when Marisa wasn't looking. A doctor spoke in careful language, the kind designed to soften impact. Theo heard the limits in the doctor's voice, the careful omissions, the words meant to soften what couldn't be softened. He watched Marisa take it in, chin lifting, eyes wetting, breath measured back into place like discipline. Nolan's hand rose toward her elbow, paused there, offering balance without presuming it was his right to hold her. He watched himself stay still because if he moved, he might fall apart. When the doctor left, Marisa forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Okay," she said, voice too bright. "Okay, we can do this. We can handle this." She said it like repeating it made it true. Nolan nodded, calm. "We will. Together." Theo stared at the floor, jaw clenched. They walked the hallway back toward the waiting area, past other families carrying their own private tragedies. Nolan lagged behind for a second, then matched Theo's pace. Theo didn't look back, but he knew Nolan was there. Nolan lowered his voice. "You don't have to act like you're indestructible." Theo winced and kept walking. "That's not an option. Someone has to be the strong one." Theo sighed. Nolan replies, "You call that love?" Theo stopped and turned, and for the first time in days, his eyes met Nolan's without pretense. Theo didn't answer. He couldn't, because the truth was, he didn't know what love was anymore. Not in a way that didn't feel like duty or obligation. He didn't know how to be anything but the one who held things up. They reached the elevator. Marisa patted her pockets, swore under her breath, and said she'd forgotten her purse, that she'd meet them downstairs in the lobby, waving them ahead with tired impatience. Theo stepped into the elevator first. Nolan stepped in beside him. For a few seconds, it was just the two of them in a small box of light and silence. Theo stared at the numbers above the door like they were instructions. Nolan moved before he could rethink it. His fingers closed gently around Theo's hand, quiet and sure. "It's okay to feel it," he said under his breath. "You don't have to carry it alone. You can lean on me." Theo didn't pull away. He stepped closer instead. Nolan did too. They folded into each other in a tight, wordless embrace, the kind that forgets walls and floors and rules, the kind that feels like sleepwalking. For a second, the hospital disappeared. The elevator slowed. The doors opened. The world came back. But something changed between them in those few quiet seconds. Something Theo couldn't undo. Back home, the house felt wrong without their mothers breathing in it. Marisa dropped her bag by the door, already halfway gone again. She said she'd sleep at the hospital, that she had emails to finish, that the quiet there might help her think. She said it like logistics, like she wasn't afraid to be alone with the machines. And just like that, the house became theirs. The silence moved differently without Marisa's footsteps in it. They stood in the kitchen for a moment, coats still on, hunger finally loud enough to notice. "We should eat," Nolan said. Theo nodded. "We should." They moved around each other carefully at first, washing hands, opening cabinets, pretending their shoulders didn't keep finding the same small spaces. Nolan opened a bottle of wine like it was an accident. Theo didn't comment when he poured 2 glasses instead of 1. They cooked slowly, their hands touching as they passed the spices. The wine softened the edges of the room, softened the edges of them. They laughed once, surprised by the sound. It felt wrong to feel good, but all the same, necessary. At some point, Nolan leaned against the counter, watching Theo move like he was memorizing him in a language he hadn't known he spoke. Theo felt it. He turned. Their eyes met. The kiss happened like an apology, soft at first, like both of them were asking permission before they enjoyed it. The kiss became less careful, wine on their lips, grief in their chests, desire rising where fear had been living. Theo's hand found Nolan's wrist. Nolan's fingers tightened in Theo's shirt. They forgot the stove. They forgot the room. They forgot the day they spent at the hospital. They forgot everything except the truth that had been circling them since the elevator. Later, much later, the kitchen was darker. The food was untouched. The wine bottle basically empty. Theo didn't let the moment slip. His hand slid from Nolan's waist to his wrists, slow but certain, turning him gently away from the counter like he already knew where this needed to go. Nolan followed without asking, his pulse visible at his throat. They left the kitchen, passed the dark doorway, entered the living room where the couch was waited for them. Theo sat first. His hand stayed on Nolan's hips, thumbs pressing in just enough to say, "Here, stay with me." Nolan looked down at him, eyes dark, mouth parted, grief still there, but crowded now by something hotter and less patient. Theo drew him closer. He climbed on top of Theo, knees settling on either side of his thighs, their bodies lining up with a quiet certainty that stole the air from Theo's lungs. The contact knocked something loose in him, a low, reckless hunger that had been pacing his chest all night. Theo's hand spread wide over Nolan's back, pulling him down until heat met heat, until every breath was shared, until the line between wanting and needing blurred. Nolan leaned forward, kissing Theo's forehead, then his cheek, then the corner of his mouth, close enough to feel promise, close enough to feel danger. Theo's grip on Nolan tightened. For a second, the house disappeared. Just the ache of another man on top of him saying his name in ecstasy. Theo swallowed hard, his voice breaking under the weight of it all. "You're my sister's best friend. She's sitting in a hospital room with our mother right now, praying things don't get worse. And we're in here wanting each other." Nolan closed his eyes, his forehead resting against Theo's like a confession. "Say stop," he whispered, "and I'll go to my room." Theo's hands came up, gripping Nolan's shirt like he was holding himself in place, and they moved closer. The house had a way of making the hours feel like they belonged to someone else. Time wasn't measured in clocks anymore. It was measured in symptoms, in good days and bad days, in the spaces between medicine doses and medical updates. Days later, Mama Gloria was back at home from the hospital, and she was feeling better than usual, which meant it was also a worse day for everyone else. Better days were cruel. They offered a glimpse of normal, like a movie trailer for a life that wasn't coming back. Gloria sat up for breakfast. She even teased Marisa about the way she always over-seasoned eggs. Marisa laughed too loudly, grateful and furious at the same time. Theo watched his mother's hands tremble slightly as she lifted her fork, and his chest tightened with love and helplessness. Nolan sat at the table with them, comfortable now in the rhythms of the house. He passed napkins. He refilled water. He smiled at Gloria like she mattered not like a patient, but like a person. Gloria's eyes lingered on Nolan. "You're a good boy," she said, voice thin but sheer. Nolan smiled gently. "I'm trying." Gloria looked between Nolan and Theo, then back to Nolan with a quiet curiosity. "You make it feel softer in this house," she said, nodding at the air as if she could point to the heaviness and the way Nolan changed the energy. "He needs that," she said. Theo's spine went rigid. Marisa looked up sharply, startled by the directness. Gloria didn't seem to notice Theo's tension. She simply reached for her tea with shaking hands. Marisa's eyes moved from her mother to Theo, then to Nolan, and Theo felt suddenly like the room had brightened too much, like the walls were too thin, like his thoughts were being projected onto the ceiling. But Marisa only exhaled, shoulders dropping. After breakfast, while Theo cleaned up and Nolan checked Gloria's medication list with Marisa, Marisa's voice softened into something almost childlike. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she told Nolan. Nolan froze for a fraction of a second, as if the words hit him somewhere deep. Then he smiled. "You don't have to do it without me," he said. Marisa's eyes filled, and she blinked hard like she refused to let tears win today. She turned toward Theo, voice firm again. "I'm going to lie down for an hour. Nolan, if you need anything, wake me." "We're going to get through this," Marisa said, while looking at Theo. Theo felt the sentence land like a weight and a prayer. He watched Marisa walk away down the hallway, leaving Theo and Nolan alone in the kitchen again, surrounded by dishes and medication and the echo of Gloria's words. He needs that. Theo stood at the counter with his hands planted, shoulders tight, breathing controlled. The normal things in the kitchen were still where they'd always been, but nothing felt neutral anymore. What they'd done didn't disappear when they stopped touching. Theo thought about Marisa the way she had looked earlier, tired but still grateful. How she trusted both of them. That trust hadn't changed. That was the problem. Nolan felt it too. They were living in the aftermath of closeness turned to consequence. He stood there understanding that what had happened wasn't private anymore, even if no one else knew yet. They weren't just carrying guilt. They were carrying information. Information they would now have to keep from the person who trusted them the most. Theo understood then that what he'd done hadn't made him reckless. It had made him someone else. Nolan spoke first, voice low, testing the idea as he said it. "She trusts us both, but maybe this stays between us." Theo didn't answer right away. "For now," Nolan added, "until things settle." Theo nodded in agreement. "For now," he said, "but it doesn't disappear just because we don't say it." They both knew what they were agreeing to. That night, Gloria's breathing changed. Just subtle enough that Theo woke up from the chair by her door with his heart already racing, already knowing something wasn't right. He stood in the doorway, watching his mother sleep, watching her chest rise and fall like it was negotiating with the air. The house felt colder even though the thermostat hadn't changed. He heard Nolan behind him in the hallway, a soft presence that had become instinctive. Nolan didn't speak. He simply stood a few feet away, giving Theo space to be a son. Marisa appeared behind Nolan, hair messy, face tense. She pressed a hand to her mouth as she watched their mother, trying not to panic. Theo stepped into the room quietly and adjusted Gloria's blanket. Gloria's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she looked confused. Then she looked at Theo, and something in her expression softened like she recognized him not as the man holding everything up, but as her child. Her hand lifted weakly, searching. Theo took it immediately, wrapping his fingers around hers. Marisa stepped closer on the other side of the bed, taking Gloria's other hand, her eyes shining. Nolan stayed near the doorway, respectful, present, silent. Gloria's gaze drifted past Theo and Marisa to Nolan, and she smiled faintly. "You're still here," she whispered. Nolan nodded, voice gentle. "Yes, ma'am." Gloria's eyes returned to Theo. Her voice was thin, but the words were clear enough to cut. "Don't be so strong you become lonely, both of you," she whispered. Gloria's eyes closed again as she drifted back to sleep. Outside the bedroom, Marisa's phone buzzed quietly with another message from a relative asking for updates. Theo stayed still, holding his mother's hand until her breathing settled back into its fragile rhythm. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, Marisa leaned her forehead against the wall and let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Nolan stepped toward her without hesitation and wrapped her in his arms. Marisa clung to him like she might dissolve otherwise. Theo watched them, his sister held by the man she trusted most, the man Theo had been standing too close to in the dark, the man whose presence had started to feel like a door Theo couldn't unsee. Nolan looked over Marisa's shoulder and met Theo's eyes, just a quiet understanding between them. Marisa pulled back, wiping her face, trying to recover dignity. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Nolan shook his head. "Don't ever be sorry for showing emotions." Marisa looked at both of them, then forced a tired smile. "We'll be okay," she said, like a spell. Theo's chest tightened, because he didn't know what okay meant anymore. Later, when Marisa finally returned to the couch and Nolan returned to the spare room, Theo stood in the hallway alone. He walked to the spare room door and stopped. His hand hovered near the frame like he might knock, like he might ask for something he wasn't allowed to want. He didn't knock. He didn't go in, but he didn't walk away either. He stood there long enough to feel the line between them, a line made of loyalty and grief and longing and all the words they refused to say. Theo knew then the line wasn't about Nolan. It was about who he'd already decided to be. Inside the room, Nolan's voice came through the door softly, as if he knew Theo was there, as if he'd been listening too. "Theo," Nolan said, voice gentle, unguarded. "You don't have to come in." Theo swallowed hard, leaning his forehead lightly against the doorframe, eyes closed. Nolan spoke again, slower, like each word mattered. "But if you stay out there," Nolan said, "don't tell yourself it's because you don't want to." Theo's breath shuddered. At the end of the scene, Theo finally answered, voice barely holding itself together. "I want to," Theo whispered. "That's the problem." From the other side of the door, Nolan's reply was quiet and devastating. "We've already crossed the line," Nolan said. "There's no denying ourselves now." This is part 2. Theo and Marisa grew up in this house as siblings. They lost their father years ago, and now they're preparing to lose their mother. Mama Gloria is still here. Still sharp, still stubborn as hell, and still deciding how her last days will be spent. Nolan is Marisa's childhood best friend. He's always been around, always trusted, always careful about the space he takes up. But something has already happened between Nolan and Theo. Something neither of them planned. Something that began as comfort and turned into intimacy. Tonight, the family house is full of friends and family, and everyone is pretending nothing has changed, even though Gloria's doctor has said she doesn't have much longer. By late afternoon, the family home was full in the particular way black homes fill when something big is happening. People arriving with food and foil pans. Someone already washing dishes like the sink was their assignment. Aunties standing in the kitchen with crossed arms and worried eyes, talking about the Lord and the weather like they could speak this into a different ending. The living room became a staging area for quiet mourning. A couple of uncles sat shoulder to shoulder on the couch, knees apart, hands clasped between their legs like they were holding themselves together. A family friend, one of those women who'd known Gloria since before Theo and Marisa were even a thought, kept refilling a paper cup with water and forgetting to drink it. Marisa moved through it all like a person on autopilot. She kept smiling when she was supposed to smile, kept touching arms and saying, "Thank you for coming," even when the words tasted like chalk. Kept making space for people to say things like, "She a fighter," and "God got her," and "We're just gonna pray," without letting her face do what her chest wanted to do, which was split open. Her brother Theo stayed close to the edge of every room, not hiding exactly, just positioned like he needed an exit at all times. Like if the grief got too loud, he would need somewhere to put it. Sometimes he'd drift toward the hallway, toward the doorway of his mother's bedroom, and stand there, staring at the soft line of light under the door. You could always tell where the room was by that light peeking through. The house might have been full, but that door made a boundary. It made everything quiet. And behind it, Gloria slept on and off. The kind of sleep where the body rests, but the spirit never fully does. Nolan, Marisa's best friend since childhood, arrived at the house just before the sun started to sink, having stepped away earlier so Theo and her could be with Gloria and their family without him in the way. He came in the way respectful men come into a family home during a moment like this. No loud greeting, no taking up space. He held a grocery bag in one hand. Some fruit, a pack of bottled waters, a pack of ginger candies, like bringing something practical was better than bringing himself. Marisa saw him first. She looked up from the kitchen doorway and her face did something fragile. "Nolan," she said, and on his name, her voice cracked a little. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't dramatic. It was relief. People had always assumed they were a couple. Growing up, it had been easier to let them believe that. They moved through the world with an ease that read as intimacy. Shared jokes, easy touch, the kind of affection that never needed explaining. And it wasn't untrue. Marisa loved Nolan deeply, just not romantically. She'd known he was gay long before he ever said anything out loud. Once, in high school, she'd tested the theory. She flashed him behind the gym in a moment of teenage curiosity and mischief. Nolan hadn't even flinched, had covered his eyes, laughed, and told her to put her shirt back on before they both got expelled. He'd passed with flying gay colors. Nolan never liked talking about his sexuality, never corrected anyone, never explained. So they let people believe what they wanted. It cost them nothing, and it kept him safe. And in moments like this, when grief cracked the air and the world felt too dark, it meant Marisa could lean into him without anyone questioning why. He crossed the room and took her into a hug that was careful, firm, and real. A hug that said, "I'm here. I'm not leaving. You don't have to perform." "How you holding up?" he asked softly. "I don't even know what holding up means right now," she said, trying to crack a smile. Nolan's thumb rubbed one slow circle at the middle of her back. Then don't. Just breathe. She nodded against his shoulder. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. But she wasn't crying. She was doing what she'd been doing all day, holding herself together. Over her shoulder, Nolan saw Theo. Theo stood near the edge of the living room, half turned away from everyone else, like his body was present but his mind had stepped somewhere quieter. Their eyes met and stayed there. For a moment, the room fell away. The aunties, the low prayers, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, all of it blurred into background noise. There was only them. The other night they had drifted into each other without meaning to, bodies twisted in passion in the midst of grief and despair. The memory of skin, of hands touching all over. The memory of Theo's weight resting over Nolan, his body warm and inviting, like he had finally found somewhere to set his hurt down. A night they hadn't planned. A night Marisa didn't know about. They had woken the next morning pretending nothing had changed. Theo felt Nolan's eyes like pressure under his ribs. He'd been half listening to hospice talk, then caught Nolan watching him. Enough to remind him that beneath the grief and the noise, something else had been growing. For weeks, if he was honest. After dark, the house softened into murmurs. Marisa cleaned until she eventually disappeared into Mama Gloria's room. She liked that alone time with her. Nolan stood in the hallway with a glass of water, staring at that closed door. Then Nolan heard it, a strange sound coming from Theo's room. Nolan followed the sound down the hall and found Theo, one hand pressed hard to the wall, the other curled against his chest. Theo's shoulders shook, breath stuttering like everything he had been holding back had finally broken loose. It was all of it. The house full of people watching his mother slowly fade away, all crashing down on him at once. Theo's head was bowed, eyes closed, like he was trying to pray his way out of it and couldn't find the words. Nolan grabbed him without thinking. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't hesitate. He stepped into Theo's space and gathered him in, wrapping his arms around him, letting Theo fold into him like that was where he was meant to be all along. "It's all right," Nolan murmured, one hand firm at Theo's back, the other cradling his head. "I got you. Just breathe with me." Theo clutched him, finally letting himself fall apart where someone strong enough was willing to hold him together. And Nolan did. A pocket of privacy. Nolan shut the door. Not hard. He didn't want anyone to know they were back there. Nolan's eyes lifted to Theo's. "You don't have to do this part alone." Theo's mouth trembled. He hated that about himself, the way his body betrayed him when he tried to be composed. "I don't understand how this is happening again. First my dad, and now my mom. I don't know if I'm strong enough for me and Marisa." It felt like grief repeating itself, the same loss wearing a different face, and for the first time, Theo wasn't sure the strength he'd inherited from his father would be enough to carry them through. Nolan grabbed Theo. "You don't have to be your father," he said quietly. "You just have to be you. And you already are what she needs because you're still here." At that moment, Theo kissed Nolan. It was a tender and trembling kiss, like Theo was asking Nolan for permission to be held in a way that wasn't just friendly. Nolan kissed him back like he'd been waiting for it. Theo's hand slid up Nolan's chest and stopped at his shoulders, gripping. His body sagged into Nolan's like he didn't know how to stand by himself anymore. They stayed like that, lips colliding with emotion. Theo let himself have this moment. The weight of his body finally giving in, his breath evening out against Nolan's chest. For a few minutes, they existed outside of everything else. The house, the grief, the names people would put on them if they knew they were tasting each other's lips, hands inside each other's shirts, close to letting themselves go all the way. There was only this, the quiet understanding of two men holding each other because it made the ache bearable. It felt honest, and for the first time that day, Theo didn't feel like he was falling apart. Morning came bright and almost rude. Sunlight poured through the thin curtains in Mama Gloria's room, painting gold stripes across the bedspread. Gloria opened her eyes and squinted at it like she was offended by how pretty it was. "I see the sun peeking," she announced, voice dry but determined. Marisa, asleep in the chair near the bed, startled awake, rubbing her face. Gloria lifted her hand slightly, making a little gesture like she was ordering coffee. "I want to go outside." Theo, standing in the doorway, froze. "Mama, you need to stay inside and rest. It's a sunny day." "I'm still living. I want to go outside," Gloria said as she raised her eyebrows. Marisa stood, smoothing her shirt like she was trying to remember how to be a daughter instead of a caregiver. Nolan appeared behind Theo, holding a folded blanket in his hands. He looked at Gloria and smiled softly. "I'll walk you outside. I could use some sunlight too." Gloria's gaze landed on him, and something in her expression eased. The backyard looked the same as it always had, which was its own kind of cruel. The same old fence, the same lopsided bird feeder, the same flower beds Mama Gloria used to bully into blooming. After some time, Marisa went back inside to grab her mother's water and medication. The screen door clicked behind her. Theo stayed close to the chair, arms folded, watching his mother like if he looked away, she might slip somewhere he couldn't follow. Nolan lingered a few steps back, hands in his pockets, giving space while never fully leaving Theo's side. Gloria looked at Theo and Nolan, really looked at them, the way she always had when something mattered. She told them about the first time she met Theo and Marisa's father. It wasn't a happy season. His mother had just passed, and she noticed him at the bus stop, tired and lost, standing like he hoped the world would pass him by. Gloria noticed how grief had softened him. She said they didn't fall in love all at once. It grew slowly, out of sadness and long conversations that didn't try to fix anything. Two people finding comfort in each other. She smiled faintly as she told it, like the memory still warmed her. She said, "Sometimes love doesn't arrive when life is generous. Sometimes it forms when everything else is being taken away." Theo felt the words land exactly where he'd been holding his anxiety the most. And his mom didn't need to say anything else. By afternoon, the rain was steady, tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. Mama Gloria lay in bed again, eyes closed, breathing shallow but calm. Marisa curled up in the chair beside her, and sometime after dinner fell asleep with her head tilted against the wall, exhaustion claiming her. And then Theo and Nolan found each other in the only place that felt private, the garage. The garage smelled like old cardboard, dust, and motor oil. It held the history of the family in stacked boxes and forgotten trophies. A bicycle with a flat tire leaned against the wall. A worn folding chair sat beside a shelf of paint cans. The garage was quiet except for the rain tapping against the metal door. Theo stood with his back to the workbench, hands braced hard on the edge, shoulders locked like he'd been standing that way for hours. Nolan stayed near the door, giving him space he didn't really want to give. She can tell how close we are. I thought we were being careful. We are, Nolan said. We're just not invisible. Theo rubbed his chest, slow, like he was trying to settle something underneath it. I shouldn't be doing this with my sister's best friend. Not while my mother is dying. I don't want to be the person who makes everything heavier. Nolan moved without thinking. One step, then another step, stopping just in front of Theo. Wanting someone doesn't make you a bad person, he said quietly. It feels like crossing the line I'm not supposed to cross, Theo said, like I should be ashamed for even wanting it. Everything feels wrong since she got sick, Nolan said, even the good things. Theo exhaled deeply. When I'm with you, my body finally lets go. That's what scares me. He didn't mean just now. He meant the way his shoulders dropped when Nolan entered a room. The way his breathing changed without permission. The way his body recognized safety before his mind could argue with it. Nolan didn't respond right away because the truth had been taking shape for a long time. Long before this moment pressed them together. He remembered being kids, Marisa dragging them into the same spaces, the same games, the same afternoons that stretched on without clocks. Playing house because it was what children did. Pretending at roles they didn't understand yet. The way Theo had taken charge even then. The way Nolan had watched him do it. There had been that one time. Too young to know what it meant. Too old to forget it. A kiss that lasted half a second longer than it should have. A look exchanged afterward that neither of them named. Nolan had carried that moment quietly, folding it into the years that followed, telling himself it was nothing because what else could it have meant? And then there were all the other times, hanging around Marisa's orbit, sitting too close on couches, laughing at Theo's jokes harder than necessary, feeling something tighten in his chest whenever Theo walked into a room and loosen again when he stayed. Nolan hadn't chased it. He'd respected the shape of their lives. He'd chosen silence because it was safer than hoping something could happen with his best friend's brother. But being here for Theo had changed the math. Seeing Theo tired and scared, watching him become softer without knowing he was doing it. Nolan hadn't fallen suddenly. He had fallen gradually. Theo barely had time to breathe before Nolan was in front of him, hands warm and sheer at his sides, guiding him in without urgency, but without hesitation either. The kiss found him mid-step. Theo backed into a shelf, metal clinking softly behind him. A box almost tipping over. They froze. The house stayed quiet. Nolan took Theo's hand and led him farther into the garage, away from the door, toward the open space near the wall. He crouched, pulling an old folded blanket from a plastic bin, shaking it out once, twice, the sound dull and soft. He laid it down like it mattered where they were going to land. Theo watched him do it, chest tight, body already forgetting how to hold itself together. "Can I make you feel better?" Nolan asked quietly. Theo didn't answer with words. He simply stepped forward and laid on the blanket. For that night, at least, Theo didn't regret it. He didn't replay his choices. He didn't measure the cost. He didn't weigh love against duty or grief against want. He let himself be held inside the small mercy of someone else's arms and the quiet of a body that knew how to stay. For a few hours, he wasn't a son waiting for loss. He wasn't a brother holding the house together. He wasn't the man who never set anything down. He was just someone allowed to feel good without earning it. The grief didn't disappear, but it loosened its grip long enough for him to breathe. Morning arrived like normal. Light slid through the kitchen window and landed on the table like it always had, catching crumbs and coffee rings and the quiet mess of people who hadn't slept enough. Marisa sat with her legs tucked under her chair, Nolan across from her, Theo leaning against the counter, one shoulder pressed into habit. For a few minutes they laughed, just enough to feel like themselves again. Someone teased someone else about burnt toast. Someone reached for the last slice without asking. The sound of forks against plates filled the space where worry usually sat. For a moment, it felt like the house had forgotten what it was holding. Down the hall, the nurse moved in and out of Gloria's room, changing bags, checking lines, speaking in a low voice meant to reassure without promising anything. Marisa took a sip of her coffee, set the mug down, and looked between Theo and Nolan with a smile that was already too knowing. "So," she said lightly, "when were y'all planning to tell me?" Theo and Nolan looked at each other, then back at her, and then almost at the same time started laughed. Not because it was funny, but because pretending it wasn't obvious suddenly felt ridiculous. Marisa rolled her eyes. "Please, between Mama dropping hints like she is on a talk show and y'all disappearing behind closed doors like teenagers, I'm not blind." Theo shook his head, smiling despite himself. "We didn't want to start something. Not with everything going on. We wanted to be respectful. Plus, we weren't sure if it was anything serious ourselves," Nolan added quietly. Marisa waved a hand. "First of all," she said, "I would love this. My best friend and brother. Two of my most favorite people in the world." Marisa leaned back in her chair, satisfied. "Think of the trips we could take," she went on. "No awkward introductions. I already like both of you. This is efficient." She looked at Theo directly, her voice softening. "I love you, and I'm glad you found something good in the middle of all this." Theo felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized was still clenched. Nolan reached for Marisa's hand and squeezed it once. Down the hall, Gloria's nurse finished adjusting the equipment and stepped out quietly. Gloria was resting. The day moved slowly, like it knew better than to rush. Phone calls were made. People checked in and promised to come by later. The house filled with that strange in-between energy, busy without being loud, heavy without being overwhelming. As evening settled, the nurse explained that Gloria was comfortable, that she was resting. Theo and Marisa took seats on either side of her bed. Marisa held their mother's hand, her thumb tracing familiar circles. Theo sat close, watching Gloria's chest rise and fall, the way he had been doing for weeks now. There was no announcement, no moment that demanded attention. Gloria's breathing simply slowed, then stopped. Marisa noticed first. She leaned forward, her face close to her mother's, waiting for the next breath that didn't come. Theo reached out, touching Gloria's arm, warm but still. Peaceful, like she'd decided on her own terms that she was done. Marisa pressed her forehead to the blanket and let out a sound that was both a sob and a release. Theo closed his eyes, his hand tightening, grounding himself in the fact that he was not alone. And somewhere between loss and love, between what had ended and what was still beginning, Theo understood something he hadn't before. Letting himself feel joy had not betrayed his grief. It was what carried him through it. And for the first time in a long time, wanting something didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like living. Thank you for listening to Stories Between Us Anthology. You can find every episode on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Rate the show and leave a comment. It helps more people find us.